Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the 2025 Kalaris Intelligence Conference, hosted by the Georgetown Center for Security Studies. We are thrilled to have you join us today for an engaging and thought-provoking conversation on intelligence and democracy. My name is Carlotta Poensgen, and I'm going to be your MC this morning. I am a graduate student in the Security Studies program here at Georgetown. Before we begin, I would like to cover a few housekeeping announcements. First, please do take a moment to silence all your phones and electronic devices, just to minimize any disruptions. Second, in keeping with Georgetown's university speech and expression policy, we encourage a respectful exchange of ideas. This policy can be found on the Georgetown Student Affairs website. Third, there will be an audience Q&A session for the final 15 minutes at the end of each panel and keynote. There will be student volunteers circulating around the room with microphones. We ask all questions to be concise, limited to one per person, and formed as a question. Please also introduce yourself and state your academic and professional affiliation. With that out of the way, I would like to thank the wonderful team at the Center for Security Studies for organizing today's conference. I especially want to thank Dr. Elizabeth Grimm, Jenna DeFosi, Jessalyn Powell, and Blake Herrera for organizing today, and our volunteers for making sure that everything runs smoothly. Thank you all for your hard work and your dedication. I also want to extend our profound gratitude and deep respect for the Kalaris family, as we wouldn't be here without the George T. Kalaris Intelligence Studies Fund, which supports the conference and intelligence studies at Georgetown. Mr. Kalaris retired from the Central Intelligence Agency in 1980 after an extraordinary career, which included clandestine assignments in Greece, Indonesia, Laos, the Philippines, and Brazil. And he served as Special Assistant to Director of Central Intelligence Stansfield Turner. Notably, Mr. Kalaris led the counterintelligence staff after an extensive search for a Soviet spy within the agency by his predecessor, which led to significant internal turmoil and disarray. Through his leadership, Mr. Kalaris was able to restore trust and order among the staff. Philanthropic support, such as the one from the Kalaris family, is more than just a financial contribution. It is a powerful statement of hope. Hope in the power of research and innovation. Hope in the future of education and in how it can help us solve the world's most difficult problems. Hope in the promise of discourse, especially by scholars and practitioners in events like this one. And finally, hope that we may learn from those who have come before us and carry their lessons forward. Thank you very much for joining us in that hope today. It is now my pleasure to introduce the Director of the Center of Security Studies, Dr. Daniel Byman. Dr. Byman is a professor in the School of Foreign Service here at Georgetown University, and is an expert on terrorism, intelligence, and international security. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Byman.
Thank you very much, Carlotta, and welcome everyone to Georgetown. We're delighted you're joining us today. The subject of intelligence and democracy is always highly relevant for the United States and other democracies, where intelligence is vital to security, yet, if abused, is a grave threat to democratic values. In today's times, however, the topic is of particular importance. Intelligence professionals are in the center of a storm today. Both their defenders and their critics' charges revolve around the democracy question. Defenders believe that democracy is under assault around the world and increasingly challenged at home, and that robust intelligence is vital. Critics claim that intelligence professionals are no longer trustworthy and may even represent a threat to democracy. Technological change makes a difficult situation even more complex. introducing new forms of espionage and analysis, and also new vulnerabilities that hostile actors can exploit. I'm pleased that the Kalaris conference will focus on many aspects of how intelligence can serve democracy and evolve with the times. And I can't think of a better group of speakers to educate us. Our first panel, Information Warfare and the Intelligence Community, Combating Influence Operations, will examine how disinformation campaigns threaten national security and democratic institutions. The panel will explore the intelligence community's evolving role in countering and mitigating these threats, particularly in the face of emerging technologies like AI-generated deepfakes. Moderating this discussion is Jessica Brandt, a leading expert on foreign malign influence and the role of emerging technologies in disinformation. She previously served as the director of the Foreign Malign Influence Center within the Office of the Director of National Intelligence and has worked extensively on policy responses to AI-enabled information warfare. Please join me in welcoming Ms. Brandt and our esteemed panelists to the stage.
Hi, everyone. It's great to be here. Thanks so much for welcoming all of us. I am very quickly going to introduce our illustrious panelists so we can endeavor to get very quickly into the conversation and importantly bring all of you into the conversation. We're going to try to make sure we have much more than 15 minutes to get you all into the discussion. So right here we have Olga Belogolova, who is the director of the Emerging Technology Initiative at SAIS and a professor in the Alperovich Institute where she teaches on trust and safety and influence operations. She previously led policy for countering influence ops at Meta and was instrumental to the Internet Research Agency investigations roughly 2017 to 19. We've Glenn Gerstell, who's former general counsel of the NSA, where he served from 2015 to 20, and is currently a senior advisor in the International Security Program at CSIS. Bill Marcellino is a senior behavioral scientist at RAND and a professor at the Pardee RAND grad school. He specializes in AI applications and influence operations and is importantly leading the development of RAND's proprietary text analysis suite. And then last but definitely not least, we have Suzanne Spalding, who's a senior advisor also at CSIS, where she directs the Defending Democratic Institutions project. She previously served as an undersecretary at DHS, leading the precursor to CISA. So thanks to all of you. Maybe, Olga, I'll turn to you first to just sort of set the stage. How do you see influence operations having evolved in the, I guess, near decade since you were first working on those early IRA investigations? I'm sort of curious also, like, you're the historian of influence operations, so where do you see continuities with the past, and what are those sort of key trends that you see as most consequential?
So, first of all, I can't believe it's been a decade, or almost a decade, since the early influence operations that we were all studying, in particular the Internet Research Agency, but also Russian military intelligence. And this connects to the sort of second part of your question immediately, because as someone who studies the history of influence operations, the microphone is working now. As someone who studies the history of influence operations, I often end up being someone who says, not much has changed. And the reason I say that is the intelligence community has provided us actually with quite a bit of information about how influence operations and in particular Soviet active measures were run during the Cold War. And you can take a look at sort of unclassified or declassified hearings where then CIA officer Bob Gates was testifying before the Senate Foreign Relations Committee in the 1980s and outlining all of the different tactics and techniques that Soviet active measures engage in. That includes things like agents of influence. We've seen that more recently as well. That includes state-controlled media. It includes engaging in creating front organizations. We've seen versions of all of that more recently in sort of the modern age of influence operations. But going back to sort of the beginning of your question, the past decade, I think for me, the most striking evolution that I've seen is the way in which influence operations are a little bit more entangled with our domestic political debate than they ever have been. And that makes this issue particularly complicated. I think when we were conceiving of this panel, one of the conversations that we all had was the fact that misinformation and disinformation is often used, much to my disappointment and yours, interchangeably. But those terms mean decidedly different things, and for good reason. Because especially when this is such a politicized issue, we want to make a distinction between foreign interference and threat actors that are deliberately attempting to deceive and manipulate people, and people who are just misinformed. They don't know any better. And those are very important distinctions in order to enable the intelligence community to do this kind of work. The problem is that the influence campaigns have understood that. The threat actors, particularly Russian threat actors, but also Iranian, Chinese, and others, have understood this difficult entanglement, particularly in a free society. And so these operations have become more and more entangled with our domestic political debate. Hiring influencers, journalists, and freelancers, finding ways to work with public relations firms. These are all ways in which Russian influence operations in particular have found ways around the detection of social media platforms and intelligence communities because they've woven themselves into the fabric of our information ecosystem, making everything.
Just often unwitting.
Exactly,
Yeah, right.
exactly. Very good point as well. Many times, to Glenn's point, the people that get roped into these things, the freelance journalists and the sometimes influencers on both ends of the political spectrum, end up not necessarily knowing that they're being used in these influence campaigns. So to me, I think that's the most striking difference of the modern age. There's certainly been a lot of other changes that we've seen probably in the last decade. Platform diversification, some of that has come because of the work that certain technology companies have done to combat these influence campaigns. And the threat actors then move to a space where they are more welcome and where they can operate more easily. Places like Telegram and TikTok in particular have been sort of more recent use cases for the threat actors. And I'll save our AI conversation for a little bit later.
Do others want to come in on this, key trends you're tracking?
So one of my concerns here, and I'm glad to hear your comments, is distinguishing between foreign malign influence efforts and the idea of mis and disinformation, or better or worse quality information. In my mind, there's a very bright line in those two things. And most of my work has been about forensics. How do I use scalable means to find outside actors, whether it's the IRA or strategic support forces for the PLA? When are other nation states using their influence efforts to try and, at scale, do unattributed work within our domestic politics? And that, to me, is a really clear case where exposing those and making them visible, there's no problem with that. The idea of deciding sort of what is better or worse information, it's easy to point to corner cases. Like if someone's saying you should drink bleach to cure a disease, we probably all agree it's a bad idea. But in practice, what gets labeled as mis and disinformation is often contested information. It's often a rhetorical and political issue, and that goes to both sides. And I love being here. There's some cat outside reading the Odyssey. I'm like, that's amazing. I'm so happy. It just speaks to everything I care about. It also reminds me that we are the kalos kagathoi. We are the beautiful and the wise. We are the knowing. It's so easy when you're in a group that has homophily, like birds of a feather flock together, right? To imagine that what we think is true, what our friends tell us is true, what our news sources tell us is true, are indeed true. And I think I am as biased and as vulnerable to echo chambers. I'm as vulnerable to information that seems plausible within my group, but is actually could be contested as anyone else's. I'm struggling daily to do that. So the idea of sort of like centralized efforts to decide what is, like a central feature of authoritarian regimes is to control information for purity. I have a really strong reaction against that, as opposed to this idea of, hey, look, if I can locate Iranian forces that are doing, unattributed work online, or say in traditional media, that's clear to me.
I mean, I'll say just during my time in government, we really viewed our efforts as uniquely focused on exposing the hidden hand of our foreign adversary, and that's it. Suzanne, did you want to comment on this?
Well, yeah, I mean, I completely appreciate what you're saying. This is a really tricky field. The blurring of lines, as has been noted, between foreign and domestic, make this particularly challenging, but not unique challenge for the intelligence community. I mean, a lot of the work they have done over the last few decades in particular has been in areas in which there is a blurring of the lines, including the counterterrorism work that Dan knows so well. And so we have to learn to navigate this. What worries me is that the conversations, and I applaud Georgetown and the Kalaris Institute for having this conversation, because this conversation is not happening enough across this country. In a thoughtful, informed way to find our way through this thicket. Instead, what has happened is that all disinformation efforts have been labeled as censorship based on censoring certain political views, and whether it's government entities that have been shut down doing this work, or outside entities that have been bullied and deterred into abandoning this work, we are not having these conversations. So I think it's really important that we roll up our sleeves and we figure out how do we manage this, because our adversaries are getting better and better. As Olga talked, they're getting more and more sophisticated. They are stepping up their efforts, not reducing their efforts. More and more countries are coming into this game, taking a page from the Kremlin's playbook. And we are unilaterally disarming. That's what worries me.
I sort of see three key trends. I mean, the first is a sort of greater number of more capable actors that are involved in this space as the idea of this kind of activity becomes normalized. The rise of commercial firms, which enable, again, more actors to kind of conduct sophisticated or targeted influence operations at scale, and importantly, complicate attribution, which is essential to the work of the intelligence community because of this bright line between the foreign and otherwise. And then just obviously, I think, most apparent to this group is like the rise of, relevant emerging technologies, AI, big data analytics. But again, it raises the number of actors, it reduces the cost of influence operations, and it also, sort of complicates attribution.
If I may add just one thing, one of the points that we often end up talking about is whether the actors are indeed getting more sophisticated or not. And I think there's certainly been a set of tools that have evolved and all these new technologies that are made available. But one thing that I want to enter into the conversation is also the fact that they deceive themselves as well. And for those of you that wanted to keep reading about that, my colleague, Professor Thomas Ridd, who wrote a whole book about active measures, has a whole article about this called "The Lies Russia Tells Itself." But I think, to me, that's one of the more fascinating pieces of this. We often sort of idolize and put on a pedestal the threat actors that are involved in the influence space, but they are also just working at a troll farm. Average people. They need to prove to their bosses that they've done their work and that they have the great metrics and everything else. And so they end up, deceiving themselves sometimes about how well they're doing at running these things. And to be honest, from everything that I've seen, sometimes it's a lot of throwing a lot of things at the wall to see what sticks. They just have the space and the time to do that.
And I think that intersects spot on with all these questions about how we measure the effectiveness of influence operations, which I hope we'll get to. I guess, Bill, I wanted to turn to you. I mean, obviously, mitigating foreign malign influence campaigns, the sort of first step is to detect them. It's obviously a whole of society endeavor, and maybe you could talk a little bit about open source intelligence as a discipline, and as a researcher, kind of what are you viewing as the most useful forensic tools, methods, approaches for detecting foreign malign influence operations? And especially, actually, you've done a lot of work on text analytics, so it's kind of surprising insights from your research on, analyzing foreign influence operations at scale.
Sure. So I think it's getting harder. It's not clear, it's not clear to us that the sort of newer tools, they're being embraced by the PLA and its support forces. It's not clear that Russia is not going back to more human enterprises and a more theoretical approach. What is the name of their? They have a theory of like sort of two opposing ideas within something like oppositional theory, but there's always a schism in every society. They're going to attack that, and they use that using theory crafting. So one thing is that it's really hard now, and increasingly harder at the level of individual messages or images to detect forensically what is authentic or inauthentic. That's true for just text analytics and for statements, right? Linguistic features that are amenable to computational patterning, they're not visible at the level of one message. We usually have to go ahead and like identify an account, get lots of it, break it into like say 1,000-word chunks to go ahead and say build a classifier on it. But then also too for images, maybe you can find there are many tells for certain kinds of generative AI for like diffusion images. However, they're sort of hard to do. They're exquisite. It takes a lot of effort to do them individually. It's hard to do them en masse. And there's always this increasing arms race where you're getting better and better means of producing better and better fake images. So I think it's hard to look at the level of the individual message to find things that are inauthentic or they're synthetic. What's probably more tenable is at the level of the network or the campaign. So there, I think I've heard the idea that intelligence is the art of making faint signals more clear. And at the level of a network analysis, the level of lots and lots of text, lots and lots of image to look for coherences across those things is a more tenable approach, but it's hard to do. And then the last thing I'd say is the lack of access to data is a real problem. So for example, at RAND for a long time, we used resellers of Twitter data and some other ones. We then went to Brandwatch, which was like a mass reseller of data, but one by one, those are being cut off. So X wants to directly sell and vend, and I think we're spending like 200 grand, a year, 250 a year to get sort of RAND-wide access to Brandwatch for a lot of different social media news sources and traditional media news sources to do our analytics on, and we could download, full text content, full image content, all the metadata, and do whatever we want to do, locally on our own systems. And I think X wanted us to be more in the range of something like $1.5 million a year to do that. That barrier was too high for us. So I think as these platforms try and monetize more robustly their data sources, it gets harder for the research world to work on them.
Did you want to say anything on open source intelligence?
So I often teach my students, it's an important part of my class to make sure that they understand how to do open source intelligence investigations. And I think generally it's kind of important for pretty much everyone in society to be able to be good at that. But there is, it's an important way of interacting with our current society, and if you put it a little bit less formally, right, it's being able to Google dork really well. Maybe that's, speaking of it flippantly, but what you're doing is you're taking what available information you have, and there's quite a bit of open source data that was available prior to the 2016 election that would have made it relatively easy to identify the IP address, and a whole bunch of other things associated with the troll farm, today known as the Internet Research Agency. But people were not, I happened to just read Russian and read in Russian, and so I was able to read Russian news sources, and there's a lot of local news reporting at the time that was really key to identifying what people were doing day to day, and also finding the sort of telemetry that was necessary to identify things like that. And so I do think outside of privately available data, there is actually quite a bit of publicly available data, and a lot of research firms do a really fantastic job of leveraging everything that is out there.
We touched a little bit on AI, and just before we kind of move to policy approaches, I think we should actually dive in. So to anyone who wants to, I'm actually curious what you all see as like even maybe the greatest misconceptions that you think policymakers have about the role of AI in influence operations. Bill, this feels like it's in your wheelhouse, but.
I don't know what policymakers think about it. I'm sort of more an expert in like what they're actually doing. Hopkins, I will say this, I'm not sure that we're aware of how our adversaries are doing theory work to operationalize available technology. So for example, there's a guy, Dr. Li Bingcheng, a really prolific Chinese author and machine learning scientist and AI scientist who happens to be at a university right next to base 311. He just happens to be constantly doing work that's sponsored by the PLA. And he's laid out a really ambitious plan for at scale, the creation of like massive persona that are synthetic, driven by generative AI. And it's kind of like a system of agents with modular control to really boost astroturfing. And so imagine this. Imagine you have people online that you're friends with. You know, like I have people online that I'm friends with on Facebook that I haven't actually met. You know, they do jujitsu or they do cosplay, and so we like interact in some way. And the idea that person is truly inauthentic, right? They're a synthetic persona, and they act realistically, and then once in a while, they say something like, "Oh, you know, I can't get a job here in Lima, Ohio, but we're worried about Taiwan. What's up with that?" So the idea, at least, that our adversaries are doing sophisticated work to think, how do we actually operationalize this technology into coherent ways to influence online discourse? I think that's important.
I have a lot to say about the AI piece, but I'll try to keep it short. I spent the greater portion of the 2024 election cycle going around and telling everyone to calm down. I think you were there for some of those conversations. But I think one of the things that I saw and was genuinely concerned about, given the research that I've done, is the fact that most of the headlines heading into the 2024 election cycle in the United States were AI is taking over and you can't trust anything. There is, you know, catastrophe coming. Whatever catastrophic language was used associated with apocalypse or anything else was in every single headline around AI use and how it's going to completely destroy trust in the information ecosystem. What I worried about was that in and of itself, that rhetoric was destroying the trust in the information ecosystem, which is the sort of meta, not the company, but the term problem, which is that when I've studied threat actors, in particular Russian influence operators, they primarily are interested in driving those wedges, but also getting people to not believe in anything at all. And if we do that work for them by hyping up new technologies or the fact that you can't trust anything anymore, they don't need to get involved. They'll just pull out the popcorn and sit and watch us destroy our own information ecosystem. So I think there needs to be a balance that is struck, and we certainly, you know, there's examples use that I think were well documented by the intelligence community. In particular, I think the ODNI reports documented several specific instances in which AI was used. But from everything the intelligence community produced, as well as the AI companies themselves in their threat reports, you could see that AI is being used, but is not fundamentally changing the capabilities and the tactics of the threat actors. Yeah. They're still doing a lot of the same. And I'm sure you probably have some insights from your work as well, whatever you can share.
I'm happy to talk about it, but yeah, I think bottom line, what we said was that it was a malign influence accelerant, but has not yet sort of wholly revolutionized influence operations. Well, go ahead. Yeah, please.
Say that if you're talking, when you said what do policymakers think about AI, at least if by policymakers you're referring to members of Congress, the ones I've had a chance to talk to in both my prior role and current roles, I think aren't even yet up to the questions that Olga and others have raised here. My sense is that many members of Congress are not familiar with AI in any great extent. No surprise, they can't be experts in everything. But to the extent that they think about it at all, it tends to be on some of the more apocalyptic issues. Is will AI take over human intelligence? Will they displace all our jobs, et cetera? I don't think too many members of Congress, even among the two intelligence committees in the House and Senate, are particularly focused about the role of AI in this area of disinformation. Yes, 2 layers down in the staff, the people are cognizant of it. They're the ones who talk to those of us in the room, et cetera. But I think there's so much concern first at very threshold steps of what's the right way to regulate AI? Is the European model the right approach? Should we be doing that here? Will we be crimping innovation, et cetera? That they're really on these very, very big picture threshold steps and haven't really dived into the questions about how can AI be used against us in a malign way. Yes, that's there, and they recognize it, but they're just not ready yet. And I think we're a few years away from having Congress really take a serious look at it, by which time there will have been significant both positives and negatives in this area. So we're behind the curve in this area, clearly.
Yeah, I mean, I will say, like, separate from lawmaking on this issue set, we, certainly engaged consistently with oversight committees on this issue throughout the cycle, and there was intense, I think, focus on this issue set. One thing, so we built a process for bringing the IC's media forensic capabilities to bear on potentially synthetic media targeting the election, and that involved lots of engagement with folks who sat in your former seat and seats like it, lots of engagement with the lawyers, and so it's just such an important part of how the IC goes about this work. And so I guess wanted to turn to you to give us some insights on, like, how does the legal framework governing the intelligence community kind of both at the same time enable, constrain, work in this space, and what's the role of the First Amendment? How does it intersect here?
Okay, and we're ending by noon, you said?
Small question.
So let me just take the IC structure first piece, and then we can get into First Amendment maybe. But I'd say the IC is both critical as well as restricted in terms of its involvement in the disinformation, in uncovering foreign disinformation. Critical because obviously that's the means by which we're going to uncover what our adversaries are doing in this area. So there's no substitute for the intelligence community. But it's structured in a way that sort of predated concerns about disinformation. We all know that the IC intelligence community in the United States consists of some 16 or 17 separate elements that are associated with the various departments, and really only 2 or 3 of them are of those elements, such as the CIA and the NSA, are ones that are probably commonly known and focus in particular in this area of foreign disinformation. And even that is quite limited because, as you know, the CIA in particular is prohibited from statute, going back to the National Security Act of 1947 that set it up, from engaging in any domestic operations at all. It's prohibited by statute from doing that. The NSA, a separate creature, National Security Agency, created by executive order originally, not originally by statute, similarly has an exclusively foreign focus, so it doesn't do domestic surveillance. The consequence of this is that there's a bit of a gap between uncovering foreign disinformation or foreign malevolent efforts, which the IC is able to do with limits. I'll talk about some of those limits in a second. And then once it finds out that information, what does it do with it? It, generally speaking, hands that information off if it thinks it's actionable and significant, et cetera, to the Federal Bureau of Investigation, which in turn has a domestic capability to address this in limited ways under federal criminal statutes, or perhaps the Department of Homeland Security, which Suzanne's old department, which might work with election security officials around the country, but again, it's very disjointed. That gets down to state and county level. So there's no one sort of integrated way of taking some information that the IC might find about a foreign actor, a research agency, for example, and translating that all the way down to people who are going to have an effect on it, whether that's a social media platform or a local official. So the very fractured nature of it, and there are good reasons that it may be fractured, it may make sense for other reasons, but that very structural reason operates as an impediment. And so a lot of the successes that the intelligence community achieves are sort of in spite of its structure, not because of its structure, not facilitated by that. I'm not being critical of that in particular. There are other reasons for that, but that is indeed a factor. Other factors are just the sheer scale of the potential target area, the surface to be uncovered or discovered or subject to surveillance. Every day, for example, 720,000 hours of content, videos are uploaded to YouTube. That's just YouTube, not X, not Instagram, et cetera. If you think, oh, well, that's a lot of big number. What is 720,000? Yeah, whatever. That's 83 years. So if you were to sit down and just watch a day's worth of YouTubes, it would take you 83 years. That's just YouTube. So my point in this is for the intelligence community to try to track the foreign sources, who's busy uploading things to X, to Facebook, to YouTube, and trying to get a handle on it is impossible. The volume is too great. And the intelligence community has other priorities too on top of disinformation. So this is a very difficult area, coupled with finally the political issues, which I know Jessica was aware of in her prior role, of wanting to make sure the intelligence community doesn't venture too far into areas that look like politics domestically because of the aspects of disinformation having an effect here. So there are a lot of structural reasons why this is a particularly challenging area. Historically, for example, the intelligence community didn't even focus on disinformation as such, and that's why I think we got caught flat-footed in 2016 with the activities of the Internet Research Agency in Russia trying to have an effect on our national elections. Since then, we've done a good job in the intelligence community of making this a big focus. But again, it's a challenge. Do you want me to talk about the First Amendment? Or do you want me to
please.
I'll try to make it quick. But in addition to the structural restrictions, sort of political statutory restrictions that prohibit the intelligence community from having integrated sort of whole of government operations to look at and uncover foreign disinformation, foreign malign influence, let alone the points that Suzanne was talking about how some of that has now been recently dismantled under the Trump administration. Put that aside for a second. There's the role of the First Amendment, which, as you all know, on some big level, simply prevents the government from getting involved in free speech here in the United States. The First Amendment, when it goes back to 1792, I guess, when it was adopted, actually wasn't, by the way, just a fun fact, was not the First Amendment. It would actually be the Third Amendment because there were two amendments to the Constitution that weren't ratified, the first and second constitutional, having something to do with apportionment and also titles of nobility. The states didn't like those, so they jettisoned that and made the Third Amendment the First Amendment, which now says, as you know, that Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of speech. Interestingly, it applies to Congress, at least on its face, but over the years, the Supreme Court and other courts have been very successful in expanding that to apply to all government, not only the executive branch and within the federal government, but all the way down to local levels of government. And exactly where the line is drawn, we can discuss, but it's clear the government has an extremely limited role in affecting speech in the United States, including that of social media platforms and the ability of individuals on social media platforms to express their views. So in some ways, the First Amendment has proved more adaptable to current technology than, say, the Fourth Amendment, restricting unreasonable searches and seizures, which has been struggling for the years to sort of find its way in technology. But the First Amendment has been applied quite robustly. The significance of that, as it's turned out in a number of Supreme Court cases, is that the federal government and state governments are prohibited from using coercion or force against social media platforms to tell them what to say. The social media platforms, under some recent Supreme Court cases, themselves have a First Amendment right, as if they were a person, to curate, to edit, to delete. There's furthermore statutory protection under something called the Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act, which you've probably heard about a little bit, which basically immunizes social media platforms from taking action to either delete a post in good faith or account in good faith, and they're not liable for content on their platforms, the way a publisher might be liable, for example, if a book was published that said something libelous, it might be held liable. Not so for Meta, even though there might be libels on its website. So the First Amendment, the problem with it is that, and the benefit of it is that it prohibits very significant government involvement in going to a social media platform and saying, take that down, that's Russian influence, you can't have that, or that's a Chinese lie, get rid of it. That's what they do. They can provide information, but anything that tips over the line into coercion, and exactly where that line is very difficult. Indeed, it was so significant, I'll wrap up my long comment here, it was so significant a concern in the government, in the Biden administration, that even though Congress said to the intelligence community, please set up a foreign malign influence center within the Office of the Director of National Intelligence, they dragged their feet because of fears of getting too political, and it took 2 years before your office was set up, roughly about 2 years or so, roughly, and they had a fabulous director after that. But this is a very, very politically fraught area, and one that we do not have a good solution for.
Yeah. I mean, I can say at ODNI, we did conduct exchanges with technology companies as part of, sort of routine course of business. Those exchanges were really at the 30,000-foot level. So we would talk about evolving adversary TTPs. We talked about, importantly, like attribution and authentication. How are you doing it? Kind of help us to understand, make sure we're doing it as well as we could be. And also it helps us to understand how to contextualize the reports that come out of different companies. So that's kind of, we were speaking at the 30,000-foot level, never at the level of the account. All of that is sort of done by FBI according to FBI's authority. So lives sort of in a separate place. Does anybody else want to sort of chime in on this, Suzanne? I'm sure you do.
Yeah, I'm flashing back to my years as an attorney at CIA and trying to keep, to engage in those policy and legal discussions to make sure that our folks were operating in a very clear policy and legal environment. And that's one of the reasons I am so worried about this issue today, is because, again, I think these are such important conversations to have. These are really tricky issues, but we need to be able to give our intelligence folks clear guidance that has public support and that Congress has agreed to, because this is an area in which the ground will shift. It is very political. And once again, I worry that we will find our intelligence folks who thought they were doing what we wanted them to do being hung out to dry because something has come to light and not everyone agrees. Or we have a new administration and they say, you did what, right? And if it is left to simply, you can't do foreign malign influence against Russia because they're now our friend, but you can go really far into looking at people inside the United States if they are advocating and working for policies and people and groups that we don't like. And that is just such a dangerous place for us to be, both obviously as a democracy and a society, but also for our intelligence community folks who take enough risks as it is to be asked to engage in an uncertain legal environment. I do think there's a clear, to me, there's a very clear role for the intelligence community. Well, there are lots of murky places, but a very clear role is figuring out what our enemy's plans and intentions are. That's a classic intelligence community effort, and it could be really important here, particularly given the challenges that have been articulated about monitoring, trying to figure this out by seeing what's happening or what are they doing on the internet. Use our traditional intelligence community skills and capabilities, figure out what our adversaries' objectives are. My other area that I spend a lot of time on is cybersecurity. And I try to advocate this in cybersecurity as well. Don't wait until you see them in your network and system and try to figure out what they're doing. Figure out what they need, what they want, what is their objective, right? And then we try to frustrate their objective. And we know that among our most important objectives is to sow division, is to exacerbate division in our country, right? It is to undermine trust in our democratic institutions and in the media, in those pillars of our democracy. We know that that is a key objective for both Russia and China. So let's think about how do we undermine that objective. Disinformation will be always with us. We're never going to get rid of disinformation. How do we build public resilience, like we are trying to build resilience in our information environment, right? How do we build public resilience? And I have long believed that one of the ways we do that is to reinvigorate an understanding of civics in our country, which we've stopped teaching. Only 1 in 20 8th graders graduate as proficient in civics in this country, and that's been that way for many, many years. So we have generations of adults who don't understand what democracy is about, don't understand how they can use democracy to be effective agents of change. And so they are susceptible precisely to this kind of disinformation. They don't understand our shared values, what unites us as a country in a constructive and productive way. So I think we do need to think about those untraditional ways of building resilience, but there's a key role for the intelligence community in helping us understand so that we can frustrate those objectives.
Glenn, it looked like you wanted to jump in, and Bill.
Just a quick point, everything I totally underscore, as always, with Suzanne, her points. But the intelligence community, I neglected to say that in addition to talking about the intentions and plans of foreign adversaries, which the IC does and puts that information out, I don't know how deeply it resonates because it again gets unfortunately politicized. But if you look at the report by ODNI, the last Global Trends report, Global Trends 2040, which was a very comprehensive view of what the world would look like from now through 2040, it very, very clearly stated that the aims of China, Russia, Iran, North Korea, our big four adversaries in both disinformation as well as cyber security and elsewhere, have very, very clear malign intent and will continue their disinformation campaign. So we know what we're doing. In some cases, we have great information about their tactics and exactly how they're doing this, how China, for example, uses a very integrated approach with everything from the Ministry of State Security on down to individual diplomats around the world saying the same thing on their Twitter accounts and using proxies to generate fake accounts in a very, very comprehensive, integrated way. The IC has discussed all this, presented testimony, but again, how much of it turns into real actionable defense is another matter. And the last point on actionable defense is there are some, I would say limited, but still very significant successes. It is possible for the United States Cyber Command, not part of the intelligence community, but the military component, sort of the military sister of the National Security Agency, to take affirmative action against computers and servers and other pieces of equipment located outside the United States and take them offline, turn computers into bricks, so to speak, if they're seen to be and subject to various levels of approval as being the sources of foreign disinformation. So there is some military component to this in very limited ways, obviously not a whole solution, but there is that capability and it has been used. And similarly, on the prosecution side, the Department of Justice has been very active over the last, certainly during the Biden administration, in uncovering and prosecuting and naming and shaming, as they say, a number of foreign actors who've been discovered through terrific forensic efforts of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. So there have been a number of prosecutions, a number of indictments, and so there is some, but they're symbolic and they're important, but it's just a drop in the bucket.
Yeah, I think those are incredibly significant avenues, and we're sort of in an asymmetric information contest with with our adversaries. Like, the task for us is to sort of leverage those advantages, our cyber capabilities. We don't have to respond in a tit-for-tat way or on terrain that they've selected.
Even one or two of them sends a chill down some of the other operators. So even though you may only be indicting one or two people in a Russian troll farm, the others who are working there wonder, gosh, am I going to get uncovered too? So it has an effect.
And the indictment, the affidavit, those were hundreds of pages of material. Like, that's how you get detailed Russian planning documents out into the public domain. So I think those are sort of important counterparts to the information that other parts of government release.
It was a wonderful teaching indictment, which they do increasingly. And I think you're right, Jessica. For anybody who's really interested in seeing some recent examples of what we're talking about, I would encourage you to go to the exhibits. They have them in Russian and they've translated them into English. And it backs up the point that Olga made, that they are sort of talking to themselves to some degree in a bubble, because what you read in there, and I don't know, maybe they're right, but they are quite convinced that there's very little they have to do because a civil war is definitely coming in the United States, and Texas is definitely going to secede. And it's fascinating to read. You get a really good insight into what they are thinking. And Olga, your point about telling the dear leader what he wants to hear, it is the equivalent of the really heavy pots, right, that they made because they were measured based on the weight of their production. Yeah.
So one of the reasons I like the idea of resilience building is on this capacity issue to monitor and detect. And I think there are three important trends technologically that make proliferation a really increasing problem as we go to a lower and lower barriers to entry, and thus more and more sub-state actors have more capacity to do this kind of work. One of them is that there are fundamental changes constantly in the architectures and the technology that underline generative AI and the ability to produce really high quality content. So essentially, if you remember, a year ago, if you were looking at text to video images, right, like Sora, you could see that dog was missing a leg or whatever. There were visible tells. That has radically changed in just 1 year to Google's version of VO. So, or for the diffusion models. Early diffusion models were kind of cool until you see someone has 6 fingers. But say modern versions like the recently introduced GPT-4o version, which are really natively multimodal and are essentially, they're transformers that are directly producing images. They can hand draw letters, for example. So there's fundamental changes in the technology that make this stuff more and more undetectable. A second thing is there's also an ever increasing amount of efficiency gains, and a lot of it's being driven by China, but also in France, in the US, in the UAE, where these things get smaller and smaller and less computationally demanding to be able to do. And the last one is an explosion in consumer and prosumer technology. So, on my mediocre consumer $4,000 Mac laptop, I can do close to the frontier text generation. I'm just at the edge of frontier image generation, and maybe if I have a Digits or some other nicer something that costs $5,000 or $10,000, and then maybe another year, I can do frontier level text to video generation. So again, not that I think that AI is the only thing that matters, good old fashioned, just prodding people, saying the right thing still matters. But I do think there's an issue where if every kid in their basement, if anyone who's pissed off, whatever, can produce really convincing and hard to detect material, that has some stakes. And we saw that in the Hamas-Gaza, the Israeli-Hamas confrontation, where we found a ton of what appeared to be non-state actor, just individuals making fake content that was really powerful on either side, and they were just using off-the-shelf materials.
Okay, so I want to get all the rest of you into this conversation. Before we do a minute of sort of forward-looking, Suzanne, you kind of opened the door to this, but I'm curious, and also for all of you, sort of lessons from past experiences that kind of help us to think about ways to, strengthen resilience today.
So a few things. I do think I touched on civics as a way of building public resilience. I think it is also really an important way of making sure that we have wise policy going forward. We need more people like Bill. We need more people like you and Olga. And Glenn and I are trained as lawyers, so we're pretty useless. But we really just, and I just recently did a report at CSIS around bringing civics concepts into STEM education in the tech sector. We need translators. We need more translators. We need these tech bros, dare I say, to understand policy imperatives, to understand what the role of government is. Why can't you just come in and treat government the way you treated your private sector company? What are the consequences of that? How is it different? Well, if they've never learned anything about the way government works, then we're going to have these problems continually. We need people who have both the technology savvy that Glenn notes Congress doesn't generally have, and that sense of policy imperative and how you get things done in a way that doesn't break things, because move fast and break things doesn't work very well for the American public when you're talking about government. So there's that. Again, I do think that folks really trying to zero in and understand with granularity what the objectives are. In 2010, a retired congressman spoke with Central European intelligence officers who had been following Putin for quite some time, who told him Putin had 3 key objectives. This was in 2010. Undermine the relationship between the US and Europe, weaken NATO, and undermine trust in the media and the justice system. If we pay attention to these objectives, we're going to be in a better place in terms of figuring out how we counter them. Congress as a customer for intelligence is really important. We've seen this in the past. If the administration is the only one tasking, if the intelligence community is only being responsive to the executive branch, to the White House, they're going to not be doing as good a job as they should be in telling their customers what questions they should be asking and taking a broader view. Congress needs to be an active customer and demander of intelligence, right? Really important, not to mention its role in oversight. Another point that my colleague Dan Byman just did a report on the ways in which disinformation is targeting and affecting private sector companies. Again, I think a really important area where we need to focus, where there is this blurring, as we have seen in cyber, and we saw after 9/11, where the private sector, and the line between government and private sector is not as bright as it used to be either.
Do others want to chime in?
I definitely do, and I couldn't agree more with Suzanne on the sort of bridging the tech and policy conversations. It's something that I've tried to do throughout my career, and I'm currently in the process of doing right now, but I spent a lot of time working in a technology company and talking to engineers that worked in Silicon Valley. And being someone who was a graduate of a program like Georgetown, I apologize, I went to SICE, I didn't teach SICE, but I did teach at Georgetown briefly. Bringing that kind of knowledge to a technology company, there are a lot of important roles for people with this kind of education to bring that knowledge to the technology companies and to people that work in technology to get them to be familiarized with the impacts of the kinds of things that they're building, because they're not always going to think about them first, but there, hopefully can be someone else in the room that can add to that. But I also spent a lot of time as someone who represented a technology company in policy conversations that were fundamentally misguided, right? There was a lot of really goodwill and criticism that was rightfully deserved, but also recommendations that were impossible to implement, and things that just were already being done, couldn't be technically done at all. I think that's a really important bridge that needs to be fixed, because you want recommendations that are actually something someone can do, and you want the tech people to understand the implications of the things that they're building. The other thing I'll say is, and I say this a lot, but I spent a lot of time as a threat intelligence analyst working inside of a technology company and as a policy person inside of a company as well. And we took down a lot of networks of fake accounts. We did a lot of incredible work in this space, and it's still being done at quite a few companies, thankfully. But it does feel, in retrospect, looking back on my sort of former tech policy career and tech intelligence career, it felt like whack-a-mole, right? You're taking a whole bunch of things down, but as I think Suzanne said earlier in the conversation, this problem isn't going away, right? We've studied it throughout history. It's not going anywhere. So there needs to be that resilience building, as Suzanne said, because we can identify and take down numerous networks every single day, but if we're not focused on rebuilding those societal fissures that are being exploited by the threat actors, then there's no, it feels like a futile task to just keep taking all these things down. And so I think the strategic communications portion of this is really important. And what I mean by that is not necessarily just shoving the truth down people's throats and hoping that they, consume it, but not assuming that people are empty vessels either, right? That, we're all just, so stupid and we can't come to our own conclusions, and it's the puppet masters that are the Russian threat actors that are telling us what to think. That's also a bad conclusion here too, because we're not that. So finding a way to create a more informed public and really empowering people and not removing their own voices.
Yeah. You guys want to chime in?
Go ahead, sir.
No, go ahead.
So one thing I'd like to see us do more of to help inform this whole process or this decision or the policy would be more empirical research on the actual effects of this kind of malign foreign influence efforts. It's not clear that there are effects. It's not clear when and where those effects are greater or worse, what the types are. I've seen a little bit of work, and one of my PhD students did a pretty interesting and innovative study a couple of years ago, like a difference in difference study of two comparable states, and trying to link excess overages for COVID vaccinations against exposure to, like pretty bad information about the dangers of mRNA vaccines, and really found in this one case no real effect. Didn't seem to actually have any effect at all. Now, there's a strong intuitive sense that these things do matter. Clearly, governments, including our own, invest in these kind of things. So I'm not saying they don't work. It's just I wish I knew better when, how, and where, and to what degree they did work. That could inform a range of things, everything from what we want to focus on for detection and takedowns, where we want to maybe do more resilience building. So I think a lack of empirical understanding of the effects of these things is hamstringing us.
I agree with all those comments, all good thoughts. And to your point about we don't really know how effective this is, and there's some indications that despite all the efforts of Russia and China in an integrated way of producing fake content on YouTube, X, et cetera, it actually ends up being seen by only X million or only X 100,000. So it seems sort of small in terms of the overall population. But of course, the question is it affecting even just 1% or 0.5% of the population? And given how divided our nation is, with elections being so close, certainly if you look back at the 4 years ago, the election was extremely close, and just a small change of the number of votes in a handful of states would have an effect. And is it possible that disinformation played a role in that? We don't know. But I want to make two quick points, which is that the sources of disinformation and its efficacy are very complex. There's multiple. It's technology, it's people, it's legal situation, legal regimes, et cetera. So there's lots of reasons we can point to as to why disinformation seems so prevalent. But the flip side of that coin is that there are also a lot of ways we can attack it and get at it. There's no one silver bullet, no one magic solution, but it has a multifaceted series of solutions, everything from empirical data, Suzanne mentioned civic education, there's some legal changes we could make, et cetera. So I think we don't have a sense in our country that we need to have an integrated, coherent approach to this. And indeed, if anything, I think there's a sense of hopelessness. We just sort of throw up our hands and say, gosh, we got the First Amendment, so we can't really say anything about it. Besides, I hate regulating tech, and I don't want to crimp innovation, so I don't really want to do too much there. And the foreign countries are going to do what they're going to do anyway, so there's just sort of some level of helplessness and a sense that we can't really do too much, and we're just sort of doomed to living in a sea of disinformation. I don't think that's correct at all, although I will admit there are very, very substantial challenges. And the last point I'll make on this is that one of those challenges is I don't think our nation fully recognizes a very significant shift in how our private sector is now responsible for national security. This is certainly true in cybersecurity, and I think it's even true in the disinformation space, which is if you go back 30 years ago, 50 years ago, whatever, when you talked about national security, you were talking about the United States having a bunch of nuclear subs and nuclear missiles that would prevent an attack from Russia or some other nuclear country. And that was national security, and it was the government's responsibility. Nobody thought that Costco or Walmart was responsible for, or Procter & Gamble was responsible for, or Facebook was responsible for national security. And yet, due to the significance of technology and a whole bunch of other factors, our national security rests increasingly in the hands of the private sector and less so in government. Not government obviously has a significant role, but I don't think our nation has really appreciated that. Mm-hmm.
There's so much that resonated in all of that, but I'm going to resist the urge to get on my soapbox. Maybe just one very quick thought is as an antidote to the nihilism, I think, like I said, I think it's a persistent asymmetric competition, and the task for us is to, just as our adversaries have identified certain asymmetries that rebound to their benefits, we should do an audit of asymmetries that rebound to our advantage, and to sort of take action in the spaces that are most conducive to our success, because, tit-for-tat approaches just prolong the contests on terrain that's advantageous to them. So open information environments, I think, are tremendous assets for democratic societies in the long run, but they do create certain sort of near-term vulnerabilities. And so there's steps we can take, of course, within the information domain, but also far beyond it, leveraging our great strengths, and that's sort of the task for us. With that, over to you all for questions. Why don't we take 2 here, and then we'll keep going. I think a microphone is coming.
Hi, I'm Cole. I'm an SSB student here at Georgetown. I was wondering, I think a more fundamental question about all of this is the who, what, and how they're talking about these sorts of things, and which parts of those really do we feel are abhorrent to, like which parts do we really care about solving and answering, right? Is it that this is a foreign actor? Is it that it's a foreign adversary actor? Is it that they're unregistered foreign actor, right? Is it about what they're saying? Is it about because it's a lie of some sort, or is it really about changing votes in an election, right? And so and is how they're doing it mattering as well? And so just sort of trying to get down to sort of some of those principal concerns of what parts of this we really care about and why we care about these particular actors doing it the way they do.
I would just say we think about foreign malign influence. So it has to be foreign, malign, which is subversive, undeclared, coercive, or criminal influence activity. That's sort of the definition that we operate on, but others.
I can also sort of go back to my platform roots and talk about a little bit why we created something called the Coordinated and Authentic Behavior Policy when I was working at Meta. And it was specifically to address some of the problems that are inherent in your question, which is sometimes you don't know who, right? And not knowing who shouldn't prevent you from taking some kind of action against the what. Sometimes the content itself may not be manipulative and deceptive. And so the content may not always be a valuable way of identifying an influence operation because many of the threat actors that I've studied use accurate content. In fact, the early analysis of the tweets from the Internet Research Agency found that some of their most shared links were SoundCloud.com and NewYorkTimes.com, right? And so if they're linking to legitimate sources and publishing divisive content that exists already in our information ecosystem, then you can't use lies on their own as your determining factor. And so the origin of something like a Coordinated and Authentic Behavior Policy, which other platforms also developed, was to try to remain both content and actor agnostic so that you can focus on the fact that someone is lying about who they are and what they're doing. The manipulation is the problem, right? It's not the content itself or the person who's doing it, because sometimes you may not know, and that's actually how, if the investigators, sort of from a more engineering perspective, forensic analysis perspective, are looking for operations, they can then find others that are engaging in these operations that they may not have been looking for in the first place, that may not have been sort of the Russias and the Chinas, but could be someone that's still lying about who they are.
Yeah, it's the inauthentic accounts, I think, that are greatest concern, certainly most to me, in terms of foreign malign influence. And it's one of the reasons why I think FARA, the Foreign Agent Registrations Act, is so valuable, because it is a way of labeling, of providing information, and then counting on the American public to take that into account. There are a lot of Americans who may choose not, that they don't care if it's coming to them from Russia or China. But there are other Americans for whom that is an important piece of information. The recent decision that they are not going to really enforce FARA, certainly against people who are acting as agents of a foreign government, I think really undercuts that notion of transparency as a way of dealing with this issue.
So I agree with this. We did a study in 2020 where we exposed different people who are ideologically, either left or right to Russian content, and they loved it, right? If you're like right wing or left wing and you get the right kind of content, you're like, this is fantastic. When we expose the source, they're like, it's still true, but I don't want to share it now because I'm being manipulated. So exposing the source and the authenticity, I think, is critical.
And so that indicates that we do have some maneuvering room in our laws to tighten up and require, for example, disclosure of foreign information, et cetera. So to your question about, so what are we worried about? I would say sort of all of the above, and I don't mean to be flip about it, but I just would like to relate one very quick anecdote that shows how foreign disinformation can have a real world effect. And if you go back to 2020, you may recall there were terrible fires in the Pacific Northwest. And it just so happened that some Facebook account person, domestic person, posted something saying, I wonder if all these fires are arson set by the Antifa group, the African American group, to foment more social change, and they're probably all arson. And this was picked up by the Russians, as you well know, who instantly grabbed it and thought, wow, here's something we can exploit, and they started with some sock puppets, fake accounts, on then Twitter and Facebook saying, yes, this is arson and you got to be careful and you need, and sure enough, a group of people started setting up vigilante roadblocks in Oregon to stop the Antifa arsonists from escaping. There were none, of course, and it got to the point that after, you can go look at this, go back and research it. It got to the point where the roadblocks were so significant that they impeded first responders and firefighters from coming in and people from evacuating because of the mile-long backups to search for these arsonists. It got to the point where the FBI and the Douglas County Sheriff in Oregon issued a statement saying this is a bunch of baloney. It's not true. Do not read these Facebook posts and do not believe them, most of which were Russian generated at that point, far surpassing the domestic ones, and it had real world consequences.
All right, so many hands. We're going to try to take two at a time. I'll go one in the back and then one in the front, unless there's only one mic runner, in which case we'll take two from the back.
Thank you so much. My name is Antonia and I'm a student here at the Security Studies program. My question is informed on a recent case study on my country's presidential elections this winter. Put it simply, what we saw in Romania was Russian money, Russian methods enabled on a Chinese social media platform, TikTok. Put it simply, we also saw 33,000 fake accounts enabled in just 2 weeks that created real tangible effects in our elections. And our IC community relied on the limited tools that IC agencies generally have when dealing with such situation, which is declassification. But by the time they declassified, the damage was impartially done. So my question is, when IC agencies choose the moment to declassify, how can they choose it strategically to foil the adversary's plans without undermining the trust of the people and looking like the boy that cried wolf? Thank you.
So, Jessica, I'd love to tackle that. Oh, you want
Sure,
to
I would like to take
questions?
two at a
Sorry.
time just so we can get more folks in. Was there another one? Here, right here. Yeah, right here.
Hi, appreciate you coming. My name is Anshul. I'm a grad student at Georgetown. I wanted to push the conversation in a different direction. We've seen some recent FBI indictments or allegations against individuals that are more specific foreign influence. There was an individual who was working on behalf of South Korea, recent U.S. senator who's working on behalf of Egypt and Qatar, and then I think there was someone up in New York who's working on behalf of China. I'm curious how you view some of these more specific targeted kind of foreign influence activities against senior people in the U.S. society, and how that conflates or combines or fuses with some of these larger disinformation, misinformation, information operations from state adversaries. Thank you.
Suzanne?
So on the first question, I think the notion of pre-bunking is really important in this area. And that is the idea that we have to get out ahead. We can't wait until we see the disinformation. And again, this goes to using our intelligence capabilities to determine plans and intentions. The best example of that, of course, was the run-up to Putin's decision to march into Ukraine. And the wonderful work that the intelligence community did to learn what the pretexts were going to be that Putin wanted to use to justify that unjustified march into a sovereign country. And then to be willing to let the policymakers make that public. And that's a really important role for the intelligence communities, to both get that information and get it in a way that they can then allow it to be made public in advance, so that then when the pretext comes up, you've already got that resilience because you've pre-bunked it. I think that's critically important. the issue of how do you not appear to be putting a thumb on the scale of the election. I tell you, in 2016, when I was working on our election security and infrastructure security for that election, that was a huge issue and a huge concern. And as a result, the recommendation was, in part, to have a requirement for regular reporting, right? And I think that's really important. And I think it's something that's important to sustain. It was Executive Order 438, I think is the number, but an executive order that said, you know, you've got to do this regular reporting in the run-up to an election on what you're seeing in regards to foreign malign influence, so that it doesn't look like you're coming out with something to influence the election. So there are a couple things you can do there.
Yeah. Can I just, so it's 13848 that requires like disclosure 45 days after an election. I guess broadly, so since 2019, there's been a notification framework, which is essentially a group of senior career civil servants from across the interagency who meet to deliberate according to a set of presidentially approved criteria that was established by the now current president, so in his first administration, and then was revalidated by the Biden administration, and will be looked at again every 2 years. But importantly, it's a group of career civil servants who are sort of vested with the authority to make decisions about when to recommend a public notification in an election context. And they have a very specific set of criteria. It has to be foreign, it has to be malign, the intelligence has to be credible, specific, and actionable. And so this sort of formal process is an effort to sort of take the politics out of it and to put rest the decision in the hands of senior career civil servants. I will say, so that process was run by our office, and the overwhelming number of the majority of notifications that we delivered this cycle were non-public notifications directly to the target. So public notifications get all the attention, obviously, for obvious reasons, but the intelligence community also has the capability of going directly to the target or the conduit of an influence operation to say, hey, we have information that suggests that you might be a target or conduit. Here's what we think you should know.
One other quick thing to add that I spent a lot of time talking both with the intelligence community and others ahead of the election cycle was about the media's role in all of this too. And I think looking at the French election in 2017 and the media blackout that happened when the Macron leaks hashtag and campaign was circulating to try to share basically a very similar hack and leak type of operation that occurred in the United States in 2016. It was attempted in 2017 in France, but it didn't work. And part of the reason it didn't work was the media wrote the sort of second day story, not the first day story. It wasn't, here's the context of contents of Macron's email. It was, here's what happened, and here's who we think it was. And so that sort of training media as well, I think is a very important piece of this, and finding a way to deliver that information to them effectively so that they are the ones that are getting that information out to the public and not sort of salivating over, John Podesta's risotto recipe and things like that.
I'll also say we thought about, we went out ahead of time and said, you're going to hear from us at 100 days, 45 days, 30 days, 15 days, so that it was tied to the calendar and not to events. And so it wasn't, we didn't have to sort of, well, why did you talk about this and not that? So there was sort of that goal, and then also just kind of set the table so that at the end we had to come in with a public notification. It wasn't like the first time, the few days before the election, it wasn't the first time the American people were hearing that Russia has these goals, Iran has these goals, here's what China's doing in the information environment, kind of setting the climate so that we could, say, hey, a storm's coming. Does anybody want to answer the question on FBI indictments and any of that stuff? No takers. Okay. Other questions? Here and here? I don't see the runner. But.
Can I just, on that FBI point, I don't have anything too deep to say on it, but it is the activities of Russia and China in particular, aimed at individuals, is all part of a very comprehensive campaign that they have. And it's just, we've been talking about disinformation, which is mostly a social media phenomenon, but their influence operations are extensive and are targeted at specific individuals. So this is really something more for the FBI and its counterintelligence role than the pure intelligence community, the traditional intelligence community elements that we've been talking about. But it's very significant, and it consumes or has consumed a very large part of the Department of Justice. I might add that many of those people in the Department of Justice who work in that area in the FBI, including a particular task force associated with it, have just been recently disbanded. So we'll see what effects that has. But it's very significant and quite worrisome.
Okay, here and here.
Thank you for being here today. My name is Joshua Bernard Pearl. I'm a student here at Georgetown, very interested in this topic. And I'm curious, you've all mentioned like Russian tactics, Chinese tactics, Iranian tactics, different goals, but have you seen examples of them actually collaborating in any of their either goals or techniques, or are you worried about that in the future?
So we did a study a few years ago on the coordination of not social media, but rather news articles distributed on the internet between Russia and China. And while we couldn't show conclusively that they were coordinating deliberately, what we could show through the sort of time series, we used like topic modeling over time, we could show that both China and Russia would float the same kinds of stories at the same time, take them down. So for example, like, child reputation laundering, or don't use American tracking software, Bill Gates is putting a chip in your brain, that kind of stuff. So at the very least, we could show that there is really, really strong, incredibly strong correlations between some of the narratives that they circulate, and hard to imagine you could do it with that kind of specificity and that kind of like really anchored, like to the week level, almost the day level, and not think it was not planned and synchronized.
I will say, in my experience looking at this forensically as well as just from a policy lens, I have not seen any direct evidence that shows any kind of collaboration. I think a lot of these threat actors will use the same sort of open source intelligence market research methods. And sometimes I think it might be a little bit dangerous for us to say things that someone is adopting Russia's playbook or something like that, because I think it gives the Kremlin and Russia a little bit more credit than they deserve. I think, all of us are, what I do know is that the threat actors read the threat reports that companies put out. They read the intelligence reports. They're monitoring all of the same things that researchers studying the space are doing. And so they're learning the same information that we're putting out there to educate people. They're learning about the ways in which their campaigns are being detected, and they're also learning perhaps from others and the types of reporting that is out there. And so I wouldn't say that's necessarily a cause for us to assume that they're collaborating, but just like the sort of useful idiots argument in the influence operations space, sometimes there's also convenience factor. We're like, oh, that's a good one. I should use that too. And we've certainly seen that with these fringe news outlets as well that have nothing to do with state actors, but Russian and Iranian and Chinese actors will just jump on some of these fringe news outlets and use them and elevate them.
Yeah.
We've certainly seen collaboration in other areas. And so if they are not collaborating in the information space yet, just stay tuned.
I would just say because they share certain targets and objectives, like whether or not they're formally collaborating, their efforts can have a sort of compounding effect. Let's take two more. Right here, and then right here.
Excuse me. Hi, good morning. Thank you so much for coming here today. My name is David Chu. I'm a first-year student in Master in Foreign Service program here in Georgetown. So my question to the panel is, so in terms of misinformation, disinformation campaign, beyond just simply, the expansion of technological means, it's also most fundamentally, at many points, to manipulate and to sort of use people's emotion, to get them believe what malicious actors want them to believe. So, for example, QAnon, for example, you can't really use no matter amount of reasoning and evidence that you present to them that this is not true. Well, the believers won't necessarily believe what you presented to them, and just because they're kind of emotionally attached to whatever they believe. So just on that, like in general, like how do we like combat like misinformation, disinformation when it comes to manipulating and exploiting people's emotion? Thank you.
Great, thanks. And then right here.
Hi, my name is Ferial, and I'm here at SSB last semester graduating. I have a question in regards to misinformation and AI. We know a lot of our adversaries like Russia or Iran hardly ever comply with any regulations and any form of international laws. And knowing that they are now collaborating on getting their hands on the latest information, technology informations, and they hardly ever comply with copyright law, and they get what they want, the technology they want, and now they have China to help them get their access on it. As of this moment today here, you guys, do you believe that democracies will prevail over autocracies when it comes to AI and misinformation?
So I'm a big believer in democracies and the strengths of democracies. I think there's been a lot of authoritarian envy in our country for a number of years. I think it was Jessica who said we need to lean into our strengths. And I think our ability to operate in a more transparent environment is a huge strength of democracies. I talk about this a lot. I talk about it in terms of training to fight in the light. If you train to fight in the dark, you could turn off the light or meet your adversary at night and you'd have the advantage, right? But the reality is a transparent world is coming at us full steam ahead, right? The world is becoming more and more transparent. I really believe the shelf life of secrets is vanishingly short. Whoever figures out how to operate in that transparent world with fewer secrets is going to prevail in the long run. And who has the advantage in operating in a transparent world? Who is more comfortable in that transparent world, right? Democracies, where the imperative for transparency is there, or Russia, Iran, North Korea, China, who need those dark corners to hide secrets from their own populations. So if we lean into transparency, and we've talked a lot about that, and as a weapon for fighting disinformation, if we lean into that in a really heavy way, I do think we are going to be in a much better place. And it applies to AI and technology challenges as well, right? The more we can provide transparency and let people make decisions, I think the better off we'll be.
I can address the other question, and I think to go even beyond just emotion, but also any sort of cognitive biases and cognitive understanding of human beings and their vulnerabilities. There's actually quite a bit of interesting research that's been done on all of that, all of the things that make us vulnerable to influence campaigns or disinformation, information overload, the reasons we gravitate towards emotion as a shortcut in order to make decisions about what information is accurate and true. And there's been a lot of studies about that and how we might be able to sort of nudge people. So nudge is a word that's often used in the sort of cognitive science space. There's actually a book called Nudge as well. But if you look at research by, even Dano Kahneman and all of that, you can think about ways in which you can encourage people to slow down. So some of the things that social media companies and others do is to add friction into the information environment. You introduce ways in which, are you sure you'd like to share this? It's been disputed, right? Or this has a label over it that says AI companies have said that this might be generated by artificial intelligence. So you find ways to sort of not get in people's way, but add additional context, because the internet is very much a context stripper. And so there's been some interesting research on that. There's definitely a lot more to do. And you mentioned QAnon in particular. I think when it comes to sort of the conspiracy networks, some of the studies have shown that people, when they're confronted with information that they already previously knew before they sort of fell for a conspiracy theory, and it doesn't align with what they already, let's say they're a computer scientist, they see something about QAnon that somehow does not align with what they already knew about computer science. That's when it sort of just breaks for them, and then they're able to leave that world. But the last thing I'll say, and this is sort of a big talking point for me that I care deeply about, is people seek all of this stuff not only because of emotion, but because they're looking for community. And so I'm a big believer that a lot of our information ecosystem problems have a lot to do with people searching for meaning and community. And we're getting some time warning, so we will.
Is that right? I thought we were done.
Okay.
11, is it done at 11:30 or 11:45? 11:45. Okay, great.
Can I just
yeah, please.
address
Then yeah.
the question up front here? Both Suzanne talking about democracy and Jessica, you talking about asymmetric advantages. One of the asymmetric advantages that the United States enjoys in this area is the fact that we have allies. That is not something you could say about Russia, China, North Korea, Iran. Maybe they have one, or maybe they have a country that's sort of friendly to them a little bit on occasion on a transactional basis, but there's no integrated sense of like-mindedness at all. And by contrast, the United States obviously has that, not only in a formal sense with the Five Eyes intelligence sharing arrangement, but just more broadly, democracies and close to democracies around the world will think the same way about the threats of disinformation, not completely aligned. I think we're years away, if ever, from some kind of formal treaty in this area. That's not what I'm suggesting, but it is absolutely the case that intelligence agencies of other countries will assist the United States, and the United States will assist them in uncovering disinformation campaigns, foreign malign influence campaigns, and that leveraging power is really significant. I would not minimize that at all, and that's a big advantage we have. To Bill's point, maybe it's the case that Russia and China collaborate in some way, but it's a very transactional basis on a particular specific thing. They're not like-minded, and they're naturally distrustful of each other. And you could just think of all sorts of ways. Just for example, disinformation in Europe, as proposed by China, looks very different from disinformation in Europe as proposed by Russia. They have completely different goals and objectives. So there's limited room for cooperation. So I think we should take advantage of the fact that we do have these alliances and exploit them in a good way.
Speaking my language.
Sorry?
I said you're speaking my language.
Yeah, okay.
On this question of what can we do, so on the first one, and I remembered, it's reflexive control theory. Yeah,
yes.
I always lose that, but it hinges on the idea that every single polity has some kind of a schism or breakpoint inside of it. For us, it's about political polarization. So if we want to be more resistant to that kind of exploitation, we have to cool the flames of polarization, which is really hard, by the way. I don't have an answer to that one. The second one on conspiracy theories, and we did a really interesting experiment or a study for Google on detecting a variety of different conspiracy theories online using machine learning, but also reviewing what the research is on why people believe in conspiracy theories and how to get them out of them. And it's not, so one, the biggest single finding I'd point to is that sympathetic engagement is the priority. The more you tell people in a conspiracy theory group that they're morons, that you hate them, there's more likely to be a doubling down inside the community, and it's called the boomerang effect. Whereas engagement, so in anti-vax communities, at least listening to their concerns over children's health and safety, which, by the way, being concerned about your kids' health and safety is not a bad thing in and of itself, or for people who believe in a conspiracy theory about hidden genocide in the world, so there's like a white genocide happening that's being masked. Actually, argumentation that's respectful actually has shown some effect. However, these seem to be hard to scale. That is, individual engagement, how do you scale that up? I don't know. So that's two concerns. And then this idea about who's going to win, especially with regards to AI. One, I love democracy, and I believe in democracy. So that's just Bill's answer. But from a Chinese perspective, the CCP, if I could shortline it right now, they are very concerned over the threats that AI poses to their control. And I think for almost anything that they do, it's about internal security. That is always the primary concern, is internal security. I think, we think at least at RAND, that right now, the CCP believes we can ride this tiger, profit from it, and then we need to exert control sort of retroactively. But I would say that, again, if light is more dangerous to them than it is to us. So I think, again, in the AI race, I don't know that they're going to survive that one the way we are. Or I think we're better positioned to handle whatever upheavals AI does than the CCP or Russia is.
And the upheavals are going to come from the application of AI. Where I think we really can excel is that innovation in figuring out, okay, how do you apply quantum? What are the applications? How do you apply AI? So I think that's really important. On the stickiness of conspiracy theories, Dan and I have talked about this. There was a lot of research done back in the heyday, if you will, of counterterrorism work around what makes these terrorist recruitment things sticky, messages sticky, and how do we counter them. And some of the things that creative people came up with, to your point about tackling the emotional piece of this more than the rational content piece of it, was humor, right? Memes are really important. Sort of the less verbal and kind of, as a lawyer, this is counterintuitive for me, but the pictures, right? So graphics that convey so much more than words, music that taps into your emotion, poetry. These kinds of ways of communicating so much more and powerfully than our rational words can, I think, are some of the ways.
Okay, we are going to take the last two questions, and then we'll come to everybody can sort of chime in also with their concluding thoughts. Yeah, right here. Yeah, you.
Hi, my name is Kirsten Crook. I'm a national security analyst at the U.S. Government Accountability Office. Very insightful conversation here today, and I'm in the International Affairs and Trade Mission team at GAO, so I'm very curious to know what thoughts come to you guys' mind of things that GAO can do to examine the intelligence community and how they can combat influence operations. Thank you.
And one more. Generally that way.
Hi, I'm Francesca. I'm a first-year undergraduate at the School of Foreign Service. Suzanne brought up an excellent point that there's kind of a segmentation of like expertise in this field, in that like there are some people who are more aware of policy issues and others who are more aware of like the technological side. I'm curious whether you think that Generation Z is kind of, having been raised in both the digital age and like a very politically polarized age, is equipped at all to deal with this information ecosystem, and if not, what we can do to create a more digitally conscious society as a whole.
Okay, big questions.
So on GAO, if I might, GAO has done some great work already in this particular area. I was just recently looking again at their report to CISA and to DHS on their work on foreign malign influence and some of the things they saw that could be done better. GAO is important because it's independent, and I hope that will remain the case. GAO is also really important because their real customer, a key customer, is Congress. And I spoke before about the importance of Congress as a customer. On the Gen Z, I do think that Gen Z holds great promise, actually, because so many Gen Zers, if you will, do care about, they want to save the world. They want to make a difference. They care about having an impact. And so even those who are drawn to more of the science, the STEM, engineering, technology fields, there's a lot in the report that I did about the reasons that it may be hard to get those people to focus on the gray areas of policy implications. But I think tapping into that motivation is a great way, among others, of bringing them, of talking to them about why they need to have an understanding of policy imperatives as well. So I think there's great promise there.
Just real quick, one of my biggest pain points with both Congress and in DOD is the lack of even a cursory conceptual understanding of technical issues. I don't think we should have I don't want flag rank officers or Congress people to be like technical experts, but at least to sort of understand the concepts. I teach at Carnegie Mellon University, and I teach a number of courses there on like social media, technology, conflict kind of courses, and they're smart kids. I mean, I'm blown away by them, and I feel like they're going to go out there and do awesome things. So, I mean, at least my little window into Gen Z, I have a lot of hope and I think I have a lot of promise.
Maybe not to add any negative piece here, but I do think that it's important for us to recognize no matter what generation somebody's in, that all of us are just human beings and we have all the same sort of cognitive vulnerabilities and emotional vulnerabilities. And so I think it's important to sort of not assume that everything's just going to fix itself and get better, but to really think about how to apply that knowledge, how to translate what you understand as an SFS student to perhaps people who are not as knowledgeable about geopolitics and policy, right? There's still going to be those natural divisions that get created no matter what generation someone is in, and so using what you know and trying to connect with people more effectively in whatever manner, you know, is most relevant to that audience, right?
On the Gen Z point, I'm both encouraged and dismayed at the same time in the sense that I think our education system has shortchanged that generation in a significant way. Suzanne's alluded to civic education, but there was a Pew study, PEW survey done a couple of months ago about how Generation Z obtains their news, and quite surprising, not surprising, there was a big divide between that generation and how earlier generations got their news. You know, from my generation, I got it from mainstream media. I watched TV and read the New York Times. That was my source of information. And now so many people in the younger generations get their news exclusively from social media. They get their news from TikTok. That is their source of news, period. And that's both good and bad. But I don't think we've done an adequate job of giving that generation the tools to understand some important concepts that we've been talking about in terms of civic education, with the consequence that there's a bit of a schism. On one hand, the generation is very excited and wants to do good and is very maybe idealistic in some ways, and yet there's also this sense of despair and hopelessness, like we can't change anything. Prior generations have screwed it up, so there's no point in doing anything. And it's very important to counteract that level of cynicism. I don't have any one solution for it, but I recognize that that is something we do need to address.
Yeah, that nihilism is sort of the point, right? The sort of eroding our confidence in the idea that there is an objective truth, because that's so fundamental to democracy, right? The idea that the truth is knowable, citizens can discern it, we can use it to govern ourselves. That's why democracies, sort of need a healthy information environment to thrive, and our adversaries, of course, have no solution.
And it corrodes faith in the ability of government to solve our problems.
Yeah.
The ability of people to hold government accountable and make government solve our problems.
Yeah. Okay, well, thanks to all of you for the many insights here, and to all of you for participating in a very lively conversation. Thanks again.